All right. Well, it's 7 o'clock. I'm Chris Murphy. I'm managing editor of the Cap Times, and I want to welcome all of you to Cap Times Idea Fest and to thank you for coming to hear our Q&A tonight with Adam Kennedy and Dr. Khalid Long, who's the dramaturg for Forward Theater's production of Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? A play Mr. Kennedy co-wrote with his mother, Adrienne. I'd like to extend special thanks to Forward Theater, which is one of the sponsors of Cap Times Idea Fest. In addition to his work as a writer, Mr. Kennedy, who's with us tonight from Virginia, is the president and founder of the Black Experience, a nonprofit that seeks to present the world with positive images of Black Americans through educational and inspirational video content, changing negative stereotypes into positive perceptions. Dr. Long does freelance dramaturg work, but he's also an assistant professor of theater at Columbia College in Chicago, where he's joining us from tonight. Specialist in Black theater and performance, Dr. Long is currently at work on a book project about the life and works of Black feminist theater artist Glenda Dickerson. Both of you, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
While I have you all here, I want to make sure you knew that this discussion will be recorded and posted to captimesideafest.com, which is where the recordings of all the festival sessions will go. We'll be posting several sessions a day through Thursday, and then we'll have in-person sessions at UW-Madison's Memorial Union on Friday and Saturday. The full schedule is available at captimesideafest.com, as well as a link to buy tickets for the in-person sessions. Cap Times members get 50% off those tickets, by the way. I'll be dropping information about all this in the chat in just a moment. Speaking of the chat, that's also the place where I urge you to go to post your questions for Mr. Kennedy and Dr. Long. They have some discussion questions prepared already, but I know they're eager to hear from you as well. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Long. Thanks again.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Adam, for joining us this evening. So I know that we have just about an hour together, and so I figured we'd jump right in. Just a reminder to our audience, I'm going to post some questions, and please submit your questions into the chat. We will have a Q&A towards the end of our discussion here. So Adam, I'm going to jump right in. Let's start off with the first question, the big question probably of the evening, and that is, how did Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles come about? What's the backstory?
Well, first I want to say thank you, Khalid, and the Forward Theater for taking an interest in the project and the play. Thank you so very much. And
Yes.
Chris Murphy and the Cap Times, for providing this platform. So thank you both for your interest and what you guys are doing. So thank you. So, Mom, how'd you meet the Beatles? Well, it's a very good question. And it's my mother, we were fortunate to live in London from 1966 to 1969. And during that time, my parents had been divorced. I have an older brother who's 7 years older. And my mother has always been a huge Anglophile. She loves everything British, English. And right before I was born, I was born in Rome, Italy. But right before I was born, my father had gotten a research grant to go to West Africa. So my parents had stopped in London for a week prior to, and then my mother decided that being in Africa wasn't quite to her liking, but she spent another 3 weeks with my brother in England, in London. And she felt very strongly, at that time she had written one of her most famous plays, Funny House of a Negro. And after her divorce, I went to live with her and my brother went to live with my dad. And my mother was sort of feeling what could she do? She wanted to do something special, and London had always drawn to her. So in 1966, she decided that the two of us would go live in London. And prior to that, she credits my brother Joe, who was a big Beatles fan at the time. And my mother wasn't that interested in the Beatles in the mid 60s, but my brother was. And, so she ended up listening to all the songs, and she stumbled upon John Lennon's book of poems, his no nonsense poems. And she decided that she wanted to see if she could turn it into a play. So she began writing some passages in New York. We went to London right after Thanksgiving in 1966. And through lots of good fortune, she ended up meeting Victor Spinetti, who who had been in several of the Beatles movies. He was good friends with them. And there were a number of other individuals who put her in contact with the Beatles. So that's how it sort of got started. And then I think in October of 1967, we actually went to, they had a studio on Piccadilly Circus. And we went to their studio, and that's where I met all four of the Beatles. And it was pretty cool. And Paul McCartney picked me up. I was 6. He picked me up and put me on his lap and started to talk to me. And then John Lennon came in and he started talking to me. And it was really a fabulous experience. I remember it quite well. But the whole process moved very, very quickly. And they had started workshops in December of 1969. And then in May of 68, they actually did a full production in London. So that's how it began.
Okay.
So that's the story of Mom, how'd you meet the Beatles?
Right.
Now the story of how it began came into fruition as what you're doing now.
Right.
Was about 10 years ago, maybe longer. You know, I'd heard these stories about living in London, and I remember so many different experiences. And I said to my mother, I said, I don't really know how you really met the Beatles. How did this actually turn out? So I said, you know, what I'd like to do is interview you. And the interview turned into a book that my publishing company published. And we got, surprisingly, we got interest from the Public Theater, Oscar Eustis at that time, who was the managing director at the Public Theater. They decided to put it together, and it had a short run at Joe's Pub at the Public Theater.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, that's how it all sort of got started. But it was really my interest in how this story really took place. And so I really, over a period of days, my mother and I really sat down and she just explained everything. And it was fantastic, but it was also, it's a heartbreaking story. And because she was, you know, my mother is this, even though she's right now is a pioneering playwright, at that time, she still was almost like a little girl from Cleveland. So she's meeting the Beatles and Sean Connery and Laurence Olivier, all these individuals. And so many of these people were her idols, people she loved seeing on screen, on the stage. And, you know, some tragic things happened where the project got taken away from her. But I still think that if she had to do it again, I think she would certainly go through those experiences. And I remember quite a few of them. So it was really wonderful.
Well, I'm going to follow up with that, you know, particularly the, you know, your point about remembering some of those moments. So, you know, throughout the play, your mother, Adrienne Kennedy, there are moments in the play where she says, you know, she's mentioning your part in this journey. And I'm curious to know, do you remember, what are some of the moments that you remember of this journey, and how did this particular journey shape your sort of perspective of the world?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's not so much about the play. It is about the 3 years we spent in London.
Right.
And at that time, there were very, very few Black Americans living in London. So we stood out. And my mother ended up becoming good friends with so many wonderful people. Ricky Houston, we used to go to her house every Sunday. She was John Huston's wife. I remember Angelica Houston, Danny, you know, very well. There were James Earl Jones, was a friend of my mother's. He came to London several times. I think he was going off to film a movie with the Burtons in Rome. And I remember my mother asked him, she said, Jimmy, Adam needs a haircut. Will you take him down to the barber and give him a haircut? So wow. He put me on his shoulders and we went down and got a haircut. Alex Haley came to the house. And I remember, you know, he was doing Roots. And I remember my mother saying to him, who do you think would be interested in the ancestors, you know, of Black people? And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to see what I can do. And right. Roots obviously became an enormous worldwide bestseller. So it was those moments. And it was interesting too, because there in 1966, 1967. I didn't know at the time, but my mother was also a big World War II fan, or history buff. And there were several homes in the area that still had remnants of what had happened in World War II. And I've become a huge World War II amateur historian based on those things. So all of those things sort of came together. So it's not so much I have memories of the Beatles, because I only met them twice.
Right.
But it's really about that period really shaped my life. And when we came back to New York in 1969. Here's this little 8-year-old with a British accent, and that was pretty. People got a big kick out of that. So that really sort of, when I think back about that, it was those really remarkable experiences. And then I was blessed enough. My father was a Peace Corps director in Sierra Leone, and that's where my brother lived. And I got a chance to go to Africa to visit him. So that was a very formative period. So being in London, predominantly all white, and then getting a chance to go to Sierra Leone, where everyone was all Black.
Right.
And so that had a very, I think, a fascinating effect on me.
Right. It's interesting. One of my follow-up questions was to ask about your father, Dr. Joseph Kennedy. And I wanted to sort of think about the ways in which his work as a pioneer also perhaps shaped your work as well.
Well, no, he was, and we'll talk a little more about that if you like, about the Black experience, but
yes,
he was the impetus for the Black experience. And he was my hero, role model, and best friend. So he had a tremendous effect on my life.
Okay.
So it's again, the Beatles. My dad would come to visit us in London during that time period, and those were very special times because I didn't get a chance to see him very much. So that had a very profound effect on me, but not so much anything in terms of the play, but in terms of his input in my life,
right,
and wanting to be like him. That was very, very strong.
Right. I do want to talk more about that. And that's one of my questions for later. And we're going to talk about your project, The Black Experience. Before we get there, so, people of the world, we know Adrienne Kennedy as a pioneering playwright, more specifically as a pioneering Black woman playwright whose plays illustrate the complexities of Black life, particularly in America. Adrienne Kennedy has been canonized specifically within the context of avant-garde theater, Black theater, and artistic movements, including the Black arts movement of the 1960s and the 1970s, as well as feminist theater. But to you, I'm assuming she's a parent, she's mom, she's mother. So what was it like having Adrienne Kennedy, this pioneering playwright, this groundbreaking playwright, as your parent?
Well, again, I've been, Khalid, I've been very blessed to have many role models living in my own household. So my parents, my grandparents, aunts and uncles, really quite extraordinary. So I never had to look outside the household for strong role models. And they instilled in me that I could do anything that I wanted to do. There were no barriers.
Right.
So my mother, sort of like my father, very humble people. And the theater, as you know, it's a tough business.
Yes.
And you're not going to make a lot of money in the theater. But so what drives you is this passion. And my mother always had this passion to write and to express herself in these very wonderful, unique ways. And I think if you asked her, I don't think she'd want to be defined as a Black writer or a female writer. She wants to be known as a writer.
Right.
And to me, that's right. It's been wonderful to see in these last year and a half, these remarkable accolades that have come upon her.
Yes.
And it's always wonderful when you can give praise to people when they're still alive, versus when they pass. So it was wonderful growing up with her in that regard, and it inspired me to want to write,
yes,
and to dream and to really push the boundaries. So, I had two parents in that regard. So that was really quite extraordinary. And I'll just say, again, being very blessed, even though my parents divorced when I was right after I was born, um, they never ever said a disparaging word about the other person. They were always supportive of each other and always supportive of me and my brother, and then my children. So that's a great testament to the two of them, that family was number one. So that was terrific, having those experiences, and getting a chance to travel with her, to meet extraordinary individuals, other people in the entertainment business and the world of theater, across the board. So it was a tremendous blessing on both sides.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you, if I could ask you,
Yes, of course.
tell me, what was it that drew you to this particular play?
So I'm the production dramaturg, and I was brought on to the project at Ford Theater after the season had been selected and so forth. And the director, Baron Kelly, I know him very, very well in the academic theater world. Baron is, in many ways, he's a mentor. And Baron approached me and said, "Hey, I'd like for you to take on this project as production dramaturg." And I said, "Adrienne Kennedy, count me in. And to also work with you, Baron, count me in." Baron and I we have a friend, a mutual friend, mentor of mine actually, who passed away in 2018, right after I got here in Chicago to take on this job at Columbia College Chicago. And my mentor's name was Paul Bryant Jackson. And he was one of the earliest scholars, excuse me, to sort of do this critical work on Adrienne Kennedy. He is the editor of the book Intersecting Boundaries, the
Yes,
Theory of Adrienne Kennedy, which I actually have a copy here. And it's well used. I mean, it's well used.
I can see that.
In fact, this is actually Dr. Jackson's copy that he co-edited with Lois Moore Overbeck. And when Dr. Jackson was my mentor in graduate school, Miami University of Ohio, and he gave me several books when I got there. One was the History of African American Theater, and the other one was this, because I did not know who Dr. Jackson was, but I knew who Adrienne Kennedy was. I learned about Adrienne Kennedy when I was an undergrad. I went to Cheyney University, the oldest historically Black college, or HBCU, and I read Funny House of a Negro in this particular book, which is Black Theater USA, again, well worn, well used. This is from my undergraduate days at Cheyney. Okay. So we read this book. I got to Miami and I looked at the bookshelf and I said, "Paul Jackson, Adrienne," I said, "Are you that Paul Jackson?" And, he became my mentor, and here we are some years later until his passing in 2018. And in many ways, because of Dr. Jackson, my work centered around Black women playwrights, both my master's thesis as well as my dissertation. And Adrienne Kennedy continues to find her way within my own writing and my work. I teach her works a lot. And so when the opportunity came, Baron said, "I want you on this project." I couldn't turn it down. In many ways, for me, it was, studying a playwright that I admire, and who I see as a pioneer in American theater, yes. Specifically, and also someone whose work, crosses disciplinary bounds: literature, theater, gender studies, cultural studies, diasporic studies, and so forth. And so that's how I came onto the project. But interesting enough, Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? I felt as though it was one of the more accessible pieces. Yes. But I also thought it was just as critically engaging. And I did a podcast last week, Theater Forward podcast, about the play. And I made a comment about how, even though this may seem to be one of the more accessible pieces, the ways in which the narrative is delivered in the play, it is just as fragmented as the other play. So it fits, right? And it allows us to have a deeper engagement, a more closer look at a critical moment within, Adrienne Kennedy's life, as well as her family's life. And you mentioned this earlier, there are many moments where she talks about your father and she talks about you, right? And she says, you were there and this happened to you, and do you remember that? And I thought that was so poignant and so important, right? Where in many ways, Adrienne Kennedy, the playwright, and delivering this narrative, she's acknowledging the other presence in her life, and how her life is also shaped by family and the importance of family as well. That is very present in this play. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. No, I think that's very true. And I think I'd like to believe the reason it comes across like that, Khalid, is that it's a mother and son just talking, just the two of us.
Right. Right.
And so there are no barriers, no boundaries. It's just a mother talking to a son about what happened in the past.
Right.
And so I think that comes across. So it was our journey, the two of us, for those 3 years.
Right.
And so I think that really does come across like that. So that's fantastic to hear that you get that sense as well.
Yes, yes. And, I want to remind our audience that, Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? It's not the only play in which you and your mother collaborated on, right? So the first, if I'm correct, the first is Sleep Deprivation Chamber, which actually, it just came to me that Dr. Jackson actually directed a few years ago at Miami University,
Okay.
as well as Ohio State Murders.
Okay.
And so, if I'm correct, Sleep Deprivation Chamber, similar to Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? This play, Sleep Deprivation Chamber specifically, takes on elements of what I would consider to be autobiographical writing. And it gives us details of this grim experience, particularly for you. And so, can you share with us just a little bit about how that play came to be and what that play is about?
Sure, I can. Let me just go back and just say, because people have asked about Mom, How'd You Meet the Beatles? Is this a work of fiction? This is a true story.
Yes.
There's nothing fictional about anything in the play. So
Yeah.
I think, people still have a hard time believing, Black folks meeting, the Beatles and Laurence Olivier and so on and so forth. It's got to be a work of fiction.
Right.
No, this is a true story. So I just want to make sure that whoever's listening realizes that everything in this play actually happened. So I just want to set that story straight.
But thank you for that. And so just to let our audience know, you've heard it straight and you've heard it from the direct source here. Adam Kennedy, co-author of Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? Yes, thank you for that.
You're welcome. So sleep deprivation. It's been 30 years that I won't go into a lot of detail, but it is a true story on my behalf. I was living in Arlington, Virginia in 1990. I was staying with my dad and my brother, and I was followed from my father lived in at that time, it still is, a very affluent area in Northern Virginia. And I was followed by a police officer for about 3 miles with his lights off.
Okay.
All right. And my father's home is it's at the bottom of a hill next to a park, and it's very dark. And again, make a long story short, the police officer turned on his lights. We had he told me to get out of the car. I got out of the car. He told me to get back in the car. I got back in the car, and I'm trying to explain to him in a civil voice, because I'd had several unpleasant encounters with police officers in the past. So I knew he has a gun, I do not. So he told me to come back and approach him. And he then struck me with his flashlight. He beat me to the ground. He kicked me, he punched me. And he beat me very badly. And within a matter of moments, my father and my brother came out of the house. All of a sudden, there were 6 or 7 police officers with their guns drawn. They're standing in the front lawn of my father's house. My dad's in his pajamas, and these officers all pointing their guns at my dad. And they arrest me. They throw me on top of a police vehicle, kick me and punch me some more. And I was arrested for assaulting a police officer. So it was a very dramatic experience. Obviously, you can only imagine. And I felt blessed not to have become George Floyd and other members. You know, I escaped with my life.
Yeah.
But that incident, not only was I charged with a crime, which we had to go to court to, I was found not guilty. And then we had a civil trial. And that whole thing took about 2 years out of my life. But that period when I was arrested and faced with possibly going to jail because the prosecutor in Arlington wanted very desperately to send me to jail. And what infuriated them is that they thought we were just some sort of average or poor Black family. And all of a sudden they were getting letters from governors and senators and celebrities. And instead of going the opposite direction and saying, okay, maybe we made a mistake, this isn't that bad, it made them even angrier that here was a family who was connected, who was daring to challenge the Arlington prosecutor's office. So I was very fearful of going to jail. And it had a tremendous effect on my family and my friends. And after it was all over, I decided to write sort of how I felt about it. And I did that, and I gave it to my mother. And I just said, what do you think? And then she decided to write her part. And within a short matter of time, we had a play.
Right.
And so again, the events, I wrote everything that really dealt with what happened to me that evening and the whole court process. My mother is her beautiful self with these very surrealistic and dreamlike scenes. So we tried to figure out how to sort of meld it together. And I think it turned out pretty well. And I think again, we were very, very fortunate. It won Best New American Play off Broadway. So we got fantastic reviews, and it's still very difficult for me to talk about it and certainly to go see it. I've seen a number of productions. And I know that there's this guy named Teddy who's playing me, but it's me, on that stage.
Right.
But so that's how that all came to fruition.
Right. So first and foremost, let me just say, on behalf of myself and the audience, I am truly sorry that you had to experience such a traumatic moment. As you stated earlier, you escaped with your life, so many don't. And I think the larger point here is that your experience is the experience of many, as well as something that folks are still going through and we should not be. So let me just start off with that. But also let me say thank you for sharing that story in the form of dramatic literature, specifically theater. Theater in many ways, as I like to say as a professor of theater, I believe that theater is a form of activism. It's where we learn stories, it's where we are informed, it's where our biases and our preconceived notions are disrupted. And I believe that plays such as Sleep Deprivation Chamber have the power to do so because it is a personal story that is very real and not necessarily imagined. So thank you for that.
No, I appreciate it. I'll just add this really quickly. I mean, one of the things, certainly when the play was done at the Public Theater in New York, and the number of times that I went, I can't tell you how amazing and awful it was. So many young Black men, particularly Black men, would come up to me and say, this happened to me, this happened to me, this experience, this happened to me. And it really is unbelievable that over 30 years since what happened to me, is still going on. And in many ways, it's worse.
Yes.
And that to me is very tragic and very disheartening. I mean, I still believe in the American dream. But, to have so many of us still suffering from this kind of situation. And I'll be honest with you, when I'm in my car and I see a police car behind me, it scares the daylights out of me.
Yeah.
Even though they drive right on by. And I try to tell, I've got 4 children and 3 sons, and I try to tell them, how to be careful, how to understand the situation. And it's still very disconcerting, but there have been people who said, yeah, just like you just said, we appreciate you sharing your story and, having a platform, because, I don't have to tell you going back to Emmett Till and Jim Crow and
Yes.
slavery. My story pales in comparison to those stories.
Yeah.
But we were lucky enough, and because of my mother, to have a platform to share the story.
Yes. And you mentioned the award earlier, and if I'm correct, I think it was an Obie Award.
Yes.
That you both won for that play,
Yes.
for Best New Play. Yeah. Which is no small feat, right? That's big. That's really big, right?
It was quite surprising. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
You said surprising. I'm curious to know why.
Well, I guess surprising in the sense that I wasn't sure. We had some pretty stiff competition, and I don't remember who, but we had I think Susan Lloyd Parks said it had something, and there were several others. But I think when I look back on it, and it's the same thing with Mom, How'd You Meet the Beatles? I always wanted to do something with my mother.
Yes.
And the fact that we took this tragedy and this very difficult time for our family, and to turn it into something positive, that was one of the greatest moments of my life when I stood on that stage. And I just said I was so happy to work with my mother. She's like my father, in that she was my hero and role model. And to be able to put my name on something with her was quite extraordinary.
Yes, awesome. Yes. Before we go on, I want to remind our audience that we are going to take a few questions towards the end of our discussion this evening. And so please do go ahead and post your questions in the chat area, and we will get to them in just a little bit. So go ahead and get those questions in there. What I find, I just want to stick on sleep deprivation chamber for just another second.
Sure.
What I find really interesting is that the play is a story that so many folks are familiar with, and in many cases can relate to. And so in my classes, or in my theater classes, including African American theater and performance, and as well as American drama, specifically those 2 courses, I teach plays under I teach modules, and I always typically include a module entitled Black Lives Matter and performance, or the Black Lives Matter movement and performance. I would argue that Sleep Deprivation Chamber is perhaps a pioneer of that genre, right? The ways in which folks are using art, literature, theater, and to some degree as a form of social protest. And also the way I think about theater and my own scholarship, theater for me, particularly within the context of cultural theater, even more specifically African-American theater and performance, it becomes a way to document histories and narratives that are in many ways lesser known, that get erased from history, right? From conventional recordings of history. And I see that the Sleep Deprivation Chamber does both, right? In many ways, it pioneered this Black Lives Matter and performance genre, as well as it is a documentation of African American history in many ways.
No, well, thank you for saying that. And we've heard that before, but not as eloquently you just put it. So no, it's well, like I said, it's being a pioneer in many ways can be quite terrific, but in other ways, not so much so. But to be a pioneer in this kind of situation is tough. But that's right, telling a story about a family. And I think, and I don't mean to put too much emphasis on this, but I think when I was growing up, in Manhattan. And after coming back from London in the 70s, the only time you saw Black people on television was if they were being arrested, if they were drug addicts, if they were welfare mothers, anything negative, Black people were there. And to be able to have, again, these role models in my home, knowing that even though the media says this, I know that that's not true. That's not my reality.
Right.
All right. Because, again, tremendous blessings. An aunt and an uncle both got PhDs, others got their masters. My father grew up in absolute poverty in a little small town in Ohio. And all of them went on to get masters or PhDs from Columbia, NYU. So quite remarkable. So I knew that the images that the media was portraying wasn't my reality. So the story about sleep deprivation is that here is a upper middle class family. We're not drug addicts. We're not anything negative. This is a family that's trying to do things right and try to achieve the American dream. And in some horrible way, if this can happen to us with a family that has all the resources that we have, what does that say about everybody else?
Yes. Yes. I'm so glad you said that. I'm glad you said that. That is important. If the folks who have access and resources, and a variety of resources, at hand, what does that say about the people who don't? That is a very important question. Thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. And it's, I'll just share really quickly. No, I mean, after I was arrested, my father wasn't quite sure who to call. And there was a person that was recommended, a lawyer who worked with the NAACP. And she was a Black woman, Black lawyer. And I never forget, we're sitting around the table and she says, I said, can I go to jail for this? And she said, yes. She said, but I need you to be honest with me. I said, okay. She said, well, I know your parents are here, but have you committed other crimes? Or is there something you want to tell me? Right. And I looked at her like, what are you talking about? So, I mean, here's a lawyer who's supposed to be protecting me, and she's assuming that I have a history.
Right.
And so it's even how our own people deal with us. Right. And so we ended up, my mother got a friend of hers from Harvard, recommended a lawyer, Roger Edelman, who died a few years ago. Absolutely fantastic guy. Worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, and he believed in us, but his law firm was very expensive. So we couldn't have gotten that kind of legal expertise without having money. Right. And so that's a whole nother part of the whole situation. So that without that resource, I probably would have gone to jail.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Well, I'm glad things turned out differently.
Yes.
And again, I'm glad that your work is an example in many ways of the devastating, what I consider to be police, state-sanctioned violence. Yes.
Yeah, and I'll just say this: it really, one of the great things about the whole situation, though, Khalid, is it brought, our family was always close, but yes, it really brought our family together as believing in me, believing in each other, and again, the aunts and uncles and cousins and friends. When I look back on it, even more so now, I just feel so blessed that so many people believed in my innocence and believed in our family. So that was a tremendous, tremendous blessing.
Because that's also, I think, one of the important elements within these kinds of moments, to have that support with family and friends. Without that support, sometimes you find yourself up a creek without a paddle, to quote my grandmother, right? That old phrase. Yeah, that support is very important. And then, in many ways, the support of family and friends, and then as we see within the context of today, in terms of these kinds of situations around police brutality and so forth, the support of the larger community and how that has an impact on how these situations get solved, or resolved, I should say, and the ways in which communities are fighting back to resist these things from happening again. Yeah.
Well, no, I think, people like yourself, deserve a lot of credit. I mean, you're taking these stories and you're sharing them with people of all colors, and you're showing the diversity of how our stories can be presented.
Yes.
So, hats off to you, no pun intended.
Yes.
With that. But no, I mean, we need, without, my mother is very fond of saying that it is scholars who have really kept her work alive.
Yes.
Because obviously her plays, they're not done on Broadway, and things of that nature, but it's scholars who continue to fall in love with her work and then teach her work.
Yes.
And then pass it on to the next generation. So, I mean, I think you're definitely a part of that. So that's fantastic.
Thank you. It's interesting because I was posed this question several times since I started work on Ford Theater's production of Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? And the question, in a variety of ways was, why are people unfamiliar with Adrienne Kennedy's work? Why are they unfamiliar with this play and the other plays and so forth? And I was, I was a little bit stunned by the question, because my response is always, did you Google Adrienne Kennedy? Have you Googled Adam Kennedy? Have you Googled the plays? And then I had to think to myself, well, it is her work is taken up a lot by scholars. But scholars, we are fascinated with the work of Adrienne Kennedy. And I think one of the reasons, and we didn't really talk about this, but I want to make sure I mention this, is because I mentioned this the other day in the podcast. Adrienne Kennedy is still with us, right, today, in this earthly realm. Her pioneering play, 1964, Funny House of a Negro. Then, if I'm correct, one of the final plays that we have to date is He Brought Her Back in a Box, 2018. That is a lengthy career. She's one of the longest living, but not just simply living, but writers who has continued to write and
Yes.
produce work, right?
Yes.
That is important to reckon. When we think about legacy, when we think about pioneers, we are often talking about folks who are not with us anymore and whose works are sitting on someone's shelves in a library collecting dust. But that is not the story, I would argue, of Adrienne Kennedy. You look, just turn the pages of American Theater Magazine. Go to Google Scholar, right? Go to the library. There's a body of work, not just simply of her work, but a body of work about the work of Adrienne Kennedy,
Yes.
right? Which I think debunks the idea that Adrienne Kennedy is sort of this for lack of a better term, underappreciated playwright. I think, but I think our goal is to continue to push out her works and also recognize that the work of Adrienne Kennedy is, and I would also include Adam Kennedy, their work extends beyond Funny House of a Negro. I think that's the goal.
Well, no, she today is actually her birthday. And no, she writes every day. I know she is very prolific. And that's one of the things, again, I admire about her and I want to do myself. I mean, she just, every day she's doing something. She doesn't believe in retirement.
Yes.
And, which is wonderful. And she still believes she has more stories to tell. And I'll just tell a kind of a quick funny story. When Funny House came out in '64, there were a lot of people in the Black community who did not like Funny House.
Yes.
And the way it depicted Black Americans. And two people who were sort of outspoken were Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis.
Yes.
And you go ahead 20 plus years later, and my mother writes Ohio State Murders. And Ruby Dee said, I want to do Ohio State Murders. Yes. And she became, from sort of not being a big fan of my mother to becoming a big advocate, her and Ossie. So it's the transformation that they were huge stars at that particular time. So it was wonderful to see their 180 and their appreciation of what my mother was trying to do. And Ruby and my mother became very good friends. So it was, it's a given time. I think all things can change.
Yes, I didn't know that story. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
That is a incredible story. Thank you. I have another question that's going to take us a bit away from the playwriting aspect of our conversation. But before I do that, I do want to turn to our chat. And we have a comment from Caroline Clay. And she says, "Hi, Adam. It's Caroline Clay from Icarus Ella and Etta on the Upper West Side, and the public's season honoring your mom 30 years ago as Queen Victoria in Funny House."
Wow.
She continues and says, "Khalid is like a son to me, and I'm so very proud to be here this evening." Hey, Caroline, good to see you. I'm glad you're here with us.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, Caroline Clay is perhaps one of my, I think, she's one of my, if not the my favorite actress in the world. She is phenomenal. Caroline and I went to graduate school together. She was getting her MFA in performance when I was getting my PhD in theater at the University of Maryland, College Park.
Okay,
And we developed a wonderful bond, and I think I've seen her in everything since.
that's fantastic.
For television and so forth. And so when I learned of Caroline's role in Ella and Etta on the Upper West Side for that celebration of Adrienne Kennedy's work, I was really excited. And then I learned that, Caroline had a longer history with the works of Adrienne Kennedy. So good to see you, Caroline. I'm glad you're with us today. And she also says, "Happy birthday, Adrienne."
I will
Yeah,
pass it on, and thank you. Thank you for sharing.
To pass that on from me as well as the folks over at Forward, and the folks part of Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles?
I will. Thank you very much.
Yes. So I want to, before we got a few questions in the chat. Before we do, I want to ask one final question on my list, and I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your current work, and that's the Black Experience. I was really intrigued with that project, and I thought we'd just spend a little bit of time discussing that.
No, well, thank you for asking. The Black Experience, and we call it the Black Experience slogan for all. It's about telling the stories of successful Black Americans to help eliminate racism around the world. And it was inspired by the life and death of my father, who passed away 2 years ago at the age of 93. And he was, I'm not sure you're familiar, but he was a Peace Corps director, as I mentioned, in Sierra Leone. He was regional director for East Asia and the Pacific in the Peace Corps. And then in the early 70s, 72, he co-founded an organization called AfriCare out of Washington, D.C. And over the course of 50 years, they raised over $1 billion to help improve the quality of life for people in Africa. And I was blessed to have traveled with him back in 1980, 81. We went to over 13 different countries in Africa, from West Africa, east to south. And it was really extraordinary to be able to see him do his thing and the commitment he had to trying to help people improve their lives. Yes. And going out to the villages, and it was extraordinary. So he's always encouraged me to do more. And when he died, it really was a devastating loss to me. And even though I had tried to do nothing in comparison to what he had done, I realized I wanted to do more. So that's where the Black Experience comes from. And as I mentioned earlier, growing up and seeing, the media portraying particularly Black men, but Black people in general, in these very negative ways, I realized that I needed to do something to make that better, because unfortunately, there's still people around the world who still have a very negative view of Black Americans, and certainly of Black men. And I felt it inherent in me to do something about that. So my wife, my son, my nephew, my daughter, we started the Black Experience. We're a nonprofit, and we tell the stories, again, of successful Black Americans. So it's through our profiles. We just did Barbara Jordan on Thursday. We've done Shirley Chisholm and A. Philip Randolph. I also conduct interviews with individuals, Ambassador Lewis, General Ward. And so it's showcasing these individuals and presenting them. We have our own YouTube channel, which we just hit 1 million views just last week, so we're very pleased with that. We're involved in, our material is used as an educational resource in schools for free. And the feedback we've gotten from administrators and teachers to be able to access this information during short bites so that young people can, digest them. So it's been very, very powerful. And, so we're very blessed. We just did our 40th episode, and, we're on track to do at least one a week for the foreseeable future. So it's, and again, people have been very, very responsive to what we're trying to do. And I would just say, if I could take a moment, to any of the people that are watching, if anyone is interested, please go to theblackexperience.us and certainly subscribe to what we're doing. And again, our content is free. So if you know teachers and educators and students who would like to have access to this kind of material, please come aboard and please support what we're trying to do.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Chris just put the link into the chat. Please, folks, visit. What you are describing actually is what we in academia, I should say, is this sort of building of a digital archive here, right? So that we can not just simply document narratives, histories, and stories, but so that we can get them out to a greater mass here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And it's one of the things that was very wonderful to hear last week from one of the schools here in Virginia. I met with them, and they've got 6 schools, about 2,400 students, quite remarkable. And one of the administrators said to me, she said, I love what you're doing. And this was a white person. She said, I love what you're doing because so many of our kids look like you.
Right.
And even with all this social media, many of these kids don't see anyone outside their communities.
Right.
And to be able to see, again, a Mae Jameson, an astronaut, or, a business consultant, a Black female business consultant, or Shonda Rhimes, wherever it is, be able to see someone who is achieving in extraordinary ways that looks like those kids. She said, that is so powerful. And that really made me feel terrific that that's how people are responding. And it's not just for Black people.
Right.
It's for all people, because the achievements of all these remarkable people, they're lessons for everyone.
Right.
So hopefully we can break down these barriers, this racism. But we're also hoping that we can inspire people of all colors to say, I can do more. I can do anything that I want.
Right.
And you have these remarkable stories of people overcoming tremendous obstacles. And if they can do it, anybody can do it. And that's part of our inspiration.
Yes, thank you. We have a comment from Devin Rosa, and she says, thank you for being a good example for young African-American people and being in a position that has great representation for people of color. Yes, I just wanted to echo that. Yes.
Thank you.
Let's take a question or two. So I have a question, and this is from Dawn Jones. And Dawn says, why do you think Ozzy and Ruby were against Funny House? Do you think it speaks to a continued dialogue about how the Negro should be portrayed?
Tough question.
Good question. Right?
Tough question. Well, I think, and obviously my mother would be better to answer that particular question, but I think the whole idea of coming out of the age and still in the age of Jim Crow at that particular time, how Black people were portrayed. There was a sense that we're coming out, and we, a little before Black is beautiful, but the idea that Afro-Americans, we are embracing a new positive identity. And I think my mother's depiction of using the word nigger, it offended a lot of people because people were trying to get away from that. And I think in the context of what she was trying to say, I think it was very important and very powerful. And it wasn't so much a negative, but I think people in the Black community, especially celebrities and so on, they were trying to move away from that. So the fact that here was this woman getting this attention by portraying Black people in a complicated way, dealing with race. You know, the characters are dealing with skin color and families issues. So I think that that was something that people wanted to sort of stay away from. But I think later on, again, I think Ruby and Ozzy, along with so many other people, began to see, and I dare to say, my mother's genius and what she was trying, the story she was trying to tell about Black American life. And that it's complex, it's complicated. I mean, we all have English and French and German blood in us. You know, we're a mixed group of people, yet we're still trying to find our own identity. And so I think my mother was trying to figure out a way, how do you tell this particular story that is complicated but yet nuanced and is also in your face to some degree.
Right.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes. I want to follow up with that and say I think that in many ways, Funhouse of a Negro was the slam that was needed during that time. It was the boom that we needed, particularly in this emerging moment of the Black arts movement. Folks were attempting to reconcile and in many ways move away from the past histories of the traumatic experiences that Black folks have suffered, right? And I think in many ways, Adrienne Kennedy's play at that time forced folks to not only reconcile, but to sort of face head on a very complicated, moment as well as past. But it's not an easy play because it's not an easy history. I think, and many, she doesn't write it in this sort of linear fashion. She doesn't employ realism, right? Because and I don't know if you could, right? If you could tell that story through the lens of realism or this linear plot. And in many ways, I would argue that, and this is actually not necessarily me, this is coming from Dr. Jackson and the folks in the collection. In many ways, Funhouse of a Negro was a pioneer in the context of post-colonial literature or post-colonial drama in many ways. So not just simply saying African Americans and their experiences, but sort of recognizing the global issues, right? The diasporic issues, right? That sort of travels down and relates directly to what was happening in America with Black folks as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think certainly the idea of having characters, Queen Victoria and Jesus and Patrice Lumumba. I mean, yes, right. She brought all of these fascinating characters together. And, it's in so many ways, it's also raw. And I think you get the sense that she's really letting it out. Right. And these characters, they're not holding back.
Right.
And I think that's one of the beauties of most of my mother's plays, is that you're being taken on a serious ride,
right?
Serious journey,
right?
That's no holds barred, and it requires you to think. I mean, you know better than I do. I mean, you go to a Broadway play and it's a musical, whatever it might be, and those are terrific. Nothing against those, but so many plays, they don't make you think. They're just there to entertain you. My mother's plays are really about taking a long moments and while you're watching it, and then once you leave the theater, what did I just see?
Right.
What did I just see?
Right.
And I think the beauty of her works is that you can see her plays multiple times and get something different each time.
Right. Right. What I want to return to Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles for a second and make the connection with the Funny House. I did not know until I read Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles early on that Diana Sands, the actress, who we can argue that came to stardom with Lorraine Hansberry's The Raisin in the Sun, 1959 Broadway production, and she went on to continue her role as Benita in the 1961 film adaptation of the play. I didn't know that Diana Sands was the original Sarah in Funny House.
Yes.
I did not, like, I was blown away. And actually, and can I be, can I tell you, Baron and I were talking, and I said, Baron, I think there's a mistake here. He says, what do you mean? I said, Diana Sands was not no, it wasn't Diana Sands. And then I did some research and I said, oh, and then I learned that it was, you know, and of course I was like, you know, okay, you know, humble yourself, Khalid, right? You know, they got it right. They know what they're doing. But I did not know that. And I thought that was so important, because oftentimes, you know, folks like me, we think of Diana Sands and we, you know, she died so early and so young, similar to Lorraine Hansberry, actually, that, you know, we know her for Raisin in the Sun. But then to make that connection, I was like, wow, that is so interesting. And then to learn that Adrienne Kennedy says, you know, I really wanted her to continue this on, but she couldn't. There were other projects at the time. And so we moved on. And yes.
That's right. That's right. And she was, when we went to London, Diana Sands was living in London at the time. And so she became, you know, she was doing stuff, I think, what's the area called there in London? I can't remember, but she was doing a number of plays.
Right.
And so it was nice that you know, they sort of reconnected, and you know, she opened up her arms, and you know, in terms of providing contacts for us, because you know, as you know from the story, you know, my
Right.
mother didn't know anyone when she went to London
Right.
after Thanksgiving in 1966.
Right.
So yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think one of I wrote about this in the Playbill essay, that what I think is really important about this play is that we get a glimpse of a vulnerable moment in Adrienne Kennedy's life. And that's not always the case, right? But also, but in one way, I will say that if you read Adrienne Kennedy's work outside of her plays, you will sort of get some more perspective of her life and times. But it was such a vulnerable moment that was shared in the play, and I thought that was so important as well. You know, and as she says at the end of the play, you know, in her search of fame and fortune. You know?
Yes, you know, and I think one of the things that's really poignant about it is that, you know, she was riding some fame, yet all these people she's meeting, particularly Laurence Olivier and you know, all these other individuals, she was starstruck. And the fact that she was working with people that she admired and grew up on.
Right.
And I think it was heartbreaking to her that they took advantage of her.
Right.
And I think she would have never have dreamed that in a million years,
Right.
because she idolized so many of these individuals.
Right.
You know, so it's you know, so that's really part of the heartbreaking part about it.
And those are the moments. You know, it's interesting when you see when you read a play, sometimes you can miss some of the nuances of the narrative, and those are many of the narratives that you know, our director Baron, as well as the performer Marty, who plays Adrienne in the play in this production, pulled out. Right. And so I encourage the audience, go and see the production. There's also an opportunity to see a recording of the production. I encourage you to get a ticket and see the production, so that you can get a greater glimpse of this narrative. Adam, we are coming to the end of our discussion here, and I want to go to the chat really quickly and just pull out a few comments from some people here, just so that we acknowledge them. We have one here, and this is from James Engstrom. And James says, hello, Khalid and Adam. He says, my late partner is Paul Jackson. And he says, I have been crying tears of joy and gratitude and a little sadness during this session. Thank you.
Thank
James,
you.
and I know you as Jim. Thank you for being here with us. The legacy continues in both the work of Adrienne Kennedy and Adam Kennedy, as well as Paul Jackson.
Yes.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that our director, Baron Kelly, is here with us as well. And Baron has a comment. He says, there's a moment at the end of our production that we have crafted. We hope Adam will watch the film production. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Adam, this has been great. This has been great. I'm filled with a lot of joy and emotion right now. Thank you.
No, thank you. And again, I know I speak for my mother when I say, we're just so thankful that you're interested in this particular work. And I mean, it's sort of like with sleep deprivation, most plays get done once and they're never heard from again. So the fact that you and Forward Theater, all of you have taken an interest in Mom, How'd You Meet the Beatles is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. And folks, get your tickets. Again, you can see it in person, or you can see a recorded production. And have a good night. And thank you all. And continue
Thank
to
you.
work.
Great talking to you. I look forward to talking to you some more.
Yes, definitely. All
Thank
right.